So moved.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
And one abstention. Item number 2, unfinished business, there being none. And item number 3, new business. An application by Celine Palm Springs LLC seeking architectural approval of an amendment to the previously approved final development plans for the Dream Hotel located at the northwest corner of Avenida Caballeros and Amada Road. APN number 508-034-020. Zone PDD 333, section 14, case number 5.1132, PD 333, tentative track map 35-236. Do we have a staff report?
Yes, Mr. Chair and members of the ERC, good evening. So before I make this presentation to you for the benefit of the new members of the committee, I would like to give you a brief background of this project itself. So the agenda mentioned architectural review, but in fact, what this is different than that. This is a final development plans approval. So the plan development district, according to our code, requires 2 review processes. First is the preliminary, when the concept and the very preliminary aspects of the development is discussed and reviewed at the Planning Commission and the City Council. The final review is when the detailed architect and design is brought before you and the Planning Commission for final approval. So that's what you have tonight. So in the case of Dream Hotel, it was previously approved in 2007, and since then it has gone through various amendments. First in 2013, 2017, 2019, and the most recent one was in 2023, in which was approved by the City Council. We were directed to present the final approval to ARC, and that's what before you tonight. So now I'm going to go on my slides. So again, the scope of review before you tonight is the final architectural design and landscape plans. In particular, I want to mention that the Dream Hotel consists of 3 main areas. One is the main hotel itself, and then the condominium tower, and then the residential component of the north and the south villas. So the north villas will be, as it said, on the north of the site, and the south villas is at the southern end of the site. I will be showing you the site plan shortly to accurately depict what I'm talking about. And as I mentioned earlier, the council previously approved the site plan, the hotel itself, and the development standards. So you are not having any review of the hotel project itself tonight, but only the residential components, the north and the south villas. Now, the north villas, again, I'm going to be showing you, and it's also on the exhibit that you have before you. The north villas contains of 12 units, and with a maximum height of 56 feet along Calle Alvarado, and 24 feet to 30 feet along on the area that abuts the center court condominium unit. On the south villas, the maximum height is 37.2 feet, and I think there is a total of 27 units on that on the south villas. Those are just the brief on the development standards itself. Now, let me draw this closer to myself so I can see it more clearly. Yeah. Yeah. So again, this is the overall site plan of the Dream Hotel. This is to the north of it is the North Villa, the one that I just talked about. And there will be 4 main structures consisting of the residential units. Again, first is the elongated one to the westernmost side of the site, and then the three structures adjoining adjacent to the center court development. And in the middle of it is the C-shaped hotel, itself, the condominium tower, and then the hotel building itself. That is not before you tonight, okay, as I mentioned earlier. And third is the South Villa, that's the other component of the residential development of this development itself. And this smaller structure here is the service building for the hotel. So on this slide, I have the project that was presented to the City Council in June of 2023, and the proposed final development plans that is before you tonight. So again, the slide or the item to my left is what was previously approved by the City Council, and this is what's before you tonight. Again, basically, it is the same project. There are some slight variations, however, it is still within the approved plan development district of this project. If you have any questions as I move along, feel free to pause and ask these questions. And now, this is just again on the our side with the North Villas, and these are the floor plans. All of these are in the exhibit that is before you. So the first on the left is the main townhome itself, and these are the three, and to the right are the three separate structures. I will always go back and forth as I'm presenting this to you, so you have a better understanding of my presentation. And this is the second level of it again. Let me just go back here. Now, the first site plan is the basement where you have the parking areas, and that is this plan right here. And the second one to my right is the ground level. And on the next slide is the second level. The third slide consists of the third level and the fourth level. Because of the recommendation that staff will be making at the end of this presentation, I'm going to make this very brief, because at the end of the day, what I will be needing from members of the committee is our comments and recommendations because of, again, staff recommendation tonight. These are the elevations, and these are all can be found in the exhibit before you. And again, these are the elevations of the North Villas. The first one, and the key to all these elevations, can be found on the bottom left side of the screen. So the first one is the North Condo elevation. The key will tell you what side of the street or where the view is taken from. And these are the sections that depicts the heights and the view and setback relative to existing development within that area, most in particular the center court development. Again, as I mentioned earlier, in 2023, well, of course, way back in 2007, the development standards, it means the setbacks, the height, the lot coverage, and the open space were all determined way back in 2007. And all through the amendment periods from 2007 to 2023, the developments have been consistent with the previously approved development standards. Again, when I talk about development standard, I'm talking about the height, the setback, the coverage, and the unit counts. They are all consistent with the planned development district. So now this is the South Villas. So this is the first level plan, the basement floor level for the South Villas. Again, let me go back to where the South Villas is located relative to the overall plan right here. So to the east of it is, Avenida Caballeros, and to the south is Amado Road. That's where the South Villas is located. Then moving forward. This slide you have on the screen now is the basement floor level, followed by the ground level. Hopefully you've all seen this before tonight, so because I'm rushing it, but again, if you have any questions, please feel free to let me know so I can hit the pause button. And then, of course, the second floor level, the third floor level, the fourth floor, and the roof level. These are the elevations of the South Villas. I also want to mention that when this was reviewed way back in June of 2023 by the City Council, they did not have the opportunity to review the final details, and that's why we are presenting all of this to you tonight. And these are the additional sections of the elevations. Again, the key will be at the bottom section of the slide, as it also shows on the packages that before you. It shows what section of the elevations each of these are. And these are the sections depicting the heights and the setbacks from different viewpoints. What is also before you is to look at the materials and color selections, making sure that these are appropriate, these are appropriate materials and colors. Again, these are shown in the exhibits before you. And I'm sure the applicant will be speaking to this later on. What is also before you is the landscape plan. Because of the slight or minor amendment that was made in 2023, because of the reconfiguration of the site itself, the Planning Commission and the City Council recommended that the applicant make a final revision to the landscape plan to be reviewed by ARC. In the staff report, we gave you a full analysis of our own review of the landscape plan and some recommendations were made. I will also be expecting some comments and recommendations from you, whether you agree with those findings or not, and to provide additional comments and directions to the applicant, staff and the applicants. These are just the overall site plan again, and the keys to the various sections of the landscape plan. The tree selections and plant selections, that's what is depicted on this slide. They show how it will look like at maturity. And again, these are just the back plane of the type of materials that will be used in the hardscape. So as part of final development plan review, applicants are required to submit a lighting plan. This is just an overview of the lighting plan. Those are typically reviewed as by staff at plan check. So again, before I make the final recommendation, these are part of the directions that the staff will be expecting the ARC to consider in providing final comments to staff and the applicant. Number one, staff will be asking that the applicant provide additional elevation and section for the service building to include the roof deck and pool area. The service building, as if you recall, it's by the South Villas. At this point, no detailed drawings or elevations were provided as part of this review. They are required. Secondly, that the applicant provide all setback dimensions on all of the plans in all areas. There are some areas, especially in the north villa section, where the buildings, the setbacks were not provided between those three structures. Those are necessary for your review. Third, that the applicant consider the redesign of rooftop material screening. Section 9303 of the code does require that the screening be integrated with to be harmonious with the overall architecture of the development. In this case, staff determination is that they do not conform to the provisions of 9303. And that perimeter walls are not to exceed 6 feet in maximum height as required in residential area by the code. And fifth, that landscape plan to align more closely with the section 14 plant list. These are recommendations, but they are not a requirement. But we are asking the applicants to look more closely and also for the ARC to provide comments on the landscape itself. It's not, we do not have issues with the design itself, but mostly with the tree selection and some of the plant selections. It's what we are looking at, what we are talking about. And also to have the applicant restudy solar control on balconies and terraces to make sure that the design will be appropriate for the desert climate. So at this time, staff recommendation is again for the ARC to review the final plan before you and provide comments and directions to staff and applicant so that a revision will be to be submitted to you for one more review before a final decision is made. Mr. Chair, I will conclude my report. The applicant is available, but staff is also available to answer any questions you may have about at this point. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Robinson. Is there any questions of staff? Member Walsh?
Thank you. Are there, in the application materials, is there any graphic that gives a better delineation of the connection between the south villas and the rooftop pool and the mechanical room?
No, not at this point. So, but the concept, if you look at the overall site plan itself, it shows there, but we do not have the materials. And that's one of the recommendations that staff is making, that the applicant provide additional materials, more detailed materials to, for us to be able to review that.
So the connection is at the second level?
It's at the second level, correct?
Right. Yes.
Okay, so if you look at the page 46 of the exhibit, number 2 on the north elevation, number 2. So,
Wait a minute.
yeah, however,
It's a small diagram there, John, on the elevation, but it's not giving much detail. If you go on to page 47, there's also from the other side, that same little bridge, but all I know, or all we really know in reviewing it is that the vertical seemed to be some kind of wood. The applicant may be able to further clarify what it is, but it's one of those details that we're asking for more information from the application on.
And there it is at the second level. Okay.
Yeah.
correct.
Any other questions of staff from the committee?
Yes, so you guys received a letter from the HOA, from the neighbors. Can somebody interpret how that relationship has gone over the years? They sounded positive, but they had a concern. Can you speak to?
So, you're talking about the letter from
Yeah.
Mr. Which of the questions? Yeah, we can restrict about 3.
You're saying just what's the general history?
Yeah, what's the general history? And it sounds like it's going in a positive direction, but there's still a little concern.
So you want a general history of the Dream Hotel?
No, just the positive trend, this is a
Well-
good, positive trend that's been going on.
So like I mentioned earlier, originally, and Mr. Donlin, you will remember very well, way back in 2005, when this project first came before us in this very room. That was when we started, and it was formally approved by the city council in 2007. And if you recall, in 2008, there was a recession, so there was a downturn in the economy. I think Ms. Kitty will probably speak better on this, but however, I believe that had something to do with the project not moving forward way back then. But since then, there have been different iterations of the amendment to the project, way back from 2007 to 2023. And if you look at the site today, they did actually commence development at some point. They did receive some building permits, but however, additional changes were requested for. The last one was in 2023. And we are all very hopeful that this will be the last amendment to the project, and this will finally move forward, you know, based on our discussions and talks with the applicants. Is that okay?
Fair enough.
I have a question. Edward,
Yes, sir.
so in terms of the planning commission review of this project, and they reviewed the height of the buildings, the new proposed site plan, and the city, where they provided their approval,
Actually, the city council,
the city council.
the city council approved it on June 5th, 2023. And as I mentioned earlier, the development standards have all been established to now, and that includes the heights, the unit count, and the setbacks, and the coverage. The reason why the landscape itself is brought back before you is because of the minor modification that was made to the area where the Sabilas is located. And of course, that wasn't a residential on the fourth amendment. It was for a different use. And also, the residential component on the not villas was slightly changed. And that's why they had to make amendment to the landscape plan itself.
And will the planning commission be reviewing this after our review of that?
This will be so the council reviewed it in June and directed that the final review will be made by ARC. And the scope of review is limited again to the north and south villas only.
Correct. Okay, thank you.
I have a question. Is the parking adequate? I mean, I know that you've increased it from 30 to 32 in the north villas, but some of those single standalone buildings only have a single car garage.
Overall, the parking requirements for this project is so packed.
Okay, thank you.
Edward, can you elaborate on the pedestrian and vehicular circulation that's a concern in here?
So in the staff report, there was a mention as to the width of the sidewalk areas. Internally, much was said in the past 15, 16 years, there are no problems or concerns whatsoever internally. However, a mention was made on the sidewalk. However, what is being proposed by the applicant was previously reviewed by the engineering department, and it's also consistent with the section 14 master plan. Concern was raised by staff. However, looking at the requirement itself, it is consistent with what is required.
Well, you are still recommending that maybe some of the sidewalks get expanded in terms of width?
I will let the applicant speak to
Okay.
that.
And so I'm looking at page 56. What was just being referenced about the sidewalks, you were talking about, it's labeled with number 19. Is that the area of concern? Along the motto.
Correct.
Okay, and then in the criteria and findings, there's a note saying the proposed 10-foot wall height does not conform. Where are 10-foot walls?
So this would be, what's that? Yeah. Yeah. The separation of this wood. Yeah, that's 5 minutes.
John, is that the recommended from 6 feet? Is that the one?
Yeah. Let's stick in residential area, 6 foot.
It shows up on page 64.
I don't have that on my slide, it's on page 64 of the exhibit.
Okay. So yeah, on the page 56, it's labeled as a
Yeah, the wall,
8-foot wall. And then here it's
the walls show up on page 64, John.
Okay,
They're listed as 10 feet walls.
okay, and then you also note first recommendation. You make a mention of solar controls. Are there any specific areas, not talking about sliding panels, but are there any particular areas that staff came across where you'd like to see broader overhangs?
Yeah, so that's in the balconies and the terraces, mentioned.
So you feel that balconies are not sufficient?
In our view, in staff's view.
When you look at some of the upper level balconies, they have a small eave or cornice hanging out, but most of them have no roofs over them at all.
Okay. Thank you.
And the applicant has indicated that it will take more on that, so they'll be addressing that in their presentation.
Okay.
And another question, along Amato, is there, parallel parking? Allowed for, they kind of have a bulb out, it marked as 09 kind of convention center landing. So it looks like the curb is recessed back on Amato. Is that a parking lane or a?
Can I come back to that? Yeah,
It's a drop off.
it is a drop off and it's not a.
And they do show a drop off, but then it seems like it extends west, over to El Dorado. So I was just trying to figure out that additional space.
You're talking about along Calle Alvarado, or are you talking about on Amato?
On Amato,
On Amato, you've got a drop off lane,
yes.
and then at the corner of Amato and Calle Alvarado, you have a bulb, what they call a bulb at the curb to bring, so that the area, people are crossing at that corner, don't have such a long distance to park. But the area that's along there is not intended. for parking.
No, not, yeah, that one.
I'm just looking at, there's some opportunities for some space in there.
Are you concerned for additional parking spaces? Is that what you-
No, to get a wider sidewalk and to keep on our way.
Yeah.
Okay, any other questions of staff? At this time, would the applicant like to make a presentation? And please indicate provide your name and address. Confirm.
Hi, good evening, ARC members. I'm Lori Kibbe. I live at 427 North Avenida Caballeros, neighbor to the project. And I'm one of the members of Swimming Palm Springs and have been with the project since its inception. So as you know, as you listen, you always have more things that you want to say than what you've written down. So I'm going to first go through some of the things that I have and then add a few things based on what I heard this evening. So the project, when it went through council, to the question about our relationship with Center Court, Actually, some of these modifications are a direct result of their input. And so we have worked very diligently to be responsive to Center Court's concerns about setbacks, heights, et cetera, and have done that, all through the development of this project, continue to develop what we think is more pleasurable for our neighbors. And I can, during questions, can show you on some of the drawings how we've actually reduced the mass on the villas, such that the open experience to Center Court is improved. But going back to what has been driving our design, we're really looking at the principles of modernism and how we've looked at both the design of the residential and the experience of the landscape, which is simplicity, clean lines, minimal ornamentation, an honest expression of the building materials and emphasis on volumes. And while we wanted to maintain that, we have this concept of alien insertions, which is a way in which we intend to insert art and other features that make the landscape, it is an 8-acre site, or almost 8 acres, make it interesting for our residents and our guests. As Edward has said, we've maintained the development standards through this entire process, being sensitive to all setbacks and height restrictions and land coverage, and have maintained actually, I think it's almost 60%, around 60% open area, which for this size site is a fairly substantial open space. So the city has made several comments which I would like to respond to, and mainly because I live in the neighborhood, so I am intimately familiar with the unhoused and the traffic and the pedestrian traffic in that area. So in regards to the fence, I believe our fence is actually 8 feet, so it may be a mistake on the 10-foot. I need to check on that, but I think we have recommended an 8-foot fence around the space. And mainly because I have a 6-foot fence and it is scaled by the unhoused, not infrequently. And given that we will have water features and residences behind this fence, we think it's imperative that we not have a scalable fence, and 6 feet is scalable. I think in that area, what you'll notice if you drive around is many of the residences have 6-foot fences and then they have 12-foot hedges. So, or 10-foot hedges. So we chose to rather do an interesting fence with peekaboo areas and not do a hedge. So though we will have planting along the fence on the outside and the inside, we didn't want to do it with hedging. So that was on that. We have chosen desert appropriate landscape materials for all of the landscape. We have varied some from what is required in the section 14 plan, mainly because we're trying to create something unique. And very much want to bring some plant materials, so they are appropriate, to try to add some variety and interest to our gardens. And so our landscape architects kind of ventured out, though being sensitive to landscape materials. In regards to the width of the sidewalks, the sidewalk, even at the convention center, is only 6 foot wide. And that whole area is actually 5 and 6 feet. I've watched the traffic. There's never a time, even at the height of attendance at the convention center, that there's an issue with the width of the sidewalks. And in fact, it's a fairly inhospitable walking area from Caballeros all the way to downtown. It is not, it's like a concrete jungle. There's very little planting, there's very little shade. In fact, there's no shade at all along that route. And we're trying to increase the landscaping along there with shading trees, not by expanding the amount of concrete that we have, but minimizing it to what's acceptable. I think if it is 5 feet, we of course can add a foot if 6 feet is more acceptable, but I don't believe we need an 8 or 10-foot sidewalks there. Let's see. So I talked about the shade. Both our architect and our landscape architects are here to answer questions specifically about the architecture. I do want to comment about what was the cooling tower for the hotel, because I think that's important to point out. That was a cooling tower which was 2 stories. We've now changed the way in which we're addressing the mechanical issues of the hotel. And so that cooling tower has now been reduced in height, and we decided to use it as an amenity to the condominiums on the south and connecting it by an open air bridge that is at the 2nd floor, available to the tenants there. And the architect can speak to the materials of what that is. But it is a landscaped area. It definitely improves the view for Center Court. And it expands over the garage entry, which is now completely underground, which it was not previously. So the parking for that, for the south condominiums is now completely underground, as it is on the north condominiums. So that's really what I have to present, because I think answering questions is probably a better way to get to some of the details. And as I said, Vic Folia, our architect, is here, and our landscape architects are on Zoom.
Okay, is there any questions of the applicant? Would you like to bring forward the architect? Forward?
Sure, he can sit to the.
Thank you for your presentation.
Evening. I'm Dick Folia with AO Architects.
Would you like to present your thoughts on the buildings and the new structures?
I think Lori will present the building description very well. It's a fairly minimal modernist design. The detailing, I think, is something you'll appreciate up close, and maybe the elevations, given the scale of the building, are a little difficult to participate in at this point, without really enlarging them to a scale that you could probably see the detail. But I think the building's fairly handsome in the neighborhood. It'll be quite an addition to this neighborhood. I don't see, I think if you recall what the old design looked like for both the north and the south villas, they were more stucco, more opaque, a little bit more of a departure from the hotel architecture than we have today. So I think the direction we're going now is an improved one. So I think it's more harmonious with the hotel architecture that was approved previously as well. Again, all the parameters, generally speaking, meet the planning approvals that have been taken care of before. There has been some comments on overhangs and shading. Some of those are very good comments. Generally speaking, we have canopy cover or trellis covers or balconies that are probably on the order of 5 or 6 feet. In some places where the balconies may be smaller than that, shorter length, we can improve that. That's not a bad suggestion. There was also a suggestion in the write-up, I believe, about some kind of vertical treatment on the exterior, possibly for the east and west exposures, which obviously the overhangs don't help you so much on the east and west exposures because of the low sun angles. So we could consider putting some external treatments in certain locations for solar control indoor. So those are points that we would take, probably could improve the project. Those suggestions are good.
Can I comment?
Please.
I did want to mention about the covering, I'm sorry, the word just escapes me, on the roof, to the roof materials.
The mechanical.
The mechanical screens. Actually, it doesn't show up in these drawings, but it does, it is integrated, it isn't sheet metal. So maybe you can speak to that.
Yeah, just as a point of clarification, I think the renderings that were provided might be, well, the proximity of where the rendering vantage points were taken for the residential buildings in particular actually don't show much of the screen because the sight lines are such that they're so close that you really don't see a lot of them because they're held back intentionally from the perimeter of the building. So what happens is the sight lines in the particular renderings we have, you really can't see much of the metal screens. But nevertheless, we would like to go ahead and look at some kind of treatment I think it almost comes off in the renderings as if it's like corrugated metal or something, and that was not the intent. They are metal screens, perforated. The machines behind them need to breathe, so we want to make sure there's some clearance and there's some latitude for the machines to have ventilation, so they work appropriately as well. And it will be a metal screen of some sort. It probably doesn't come off so well in the renderings, and we can improve that. And we can add actually a snippet or some kind of detailed material explanation that's better than we had shown before. So that's a good point. We can certainly do that. And that's both the hotel and the residences for that matter will have a similar kind of language.
Okay, thank you. Is there any questions of the architecture team? Member Walsh?
Yes, part of the struggle, I think, is most of the graphics are rightfully focused on building massing and issues like that. And it's hard in some cases to get a sense of the livability of the juxtaposition of certain elements that are there. One of them is, and I couldn't find it in the staff report, but I think there was a comment of concern about the townhouse massing in the North Villas and the relationship of the buildings and the closeness of them. Do I have that right, even as a question?
Yeah, I think there's several diagrams, and these are going back, the diagrams that were, let me should say, the diagrams that were introduced into the package that you have before you today were taken from the original diagrams that were approved, I want to say in 23, when both villa buildings were analyzed in June of 23, I believe. And the sightlines in particular with respect to the center court property are such that the townhome, the villas, it's called, the townhomes that are three freestanding buildings immediately adjacent to the center court property towards the east, had a height, say, envelope they wanted to maintain. And we're still maintaining that envelope. So the sections were included in the diagrams you have received to replicate what was there and approved. So we're not reanalyzing that issue per se, we're just redemonstrating that these still comply with those old dimensions, both the horizontal dimension from the property line and the height dimension of the mass at that setback.
Actually, I need to clarify. That is a direct result of our discussions with Center Court. Previously, it was higher. And so what they wanted is they wanted an improved sightline. We came up with a sightline that the Center Court approved and was happy with, which resulted in that those could only be to the height that they are at 2 stories. And the square footage was moved into the tower to the west. So this is a direct result of our interactions with Center Court and how they wanted the massing of the building. Previously, it was 3 and 4 story buildings where those 2 story buildings existed in the original submittal. So this is a result of the changes to that.
So I'm gonna repeat it back, so I've got it. So you took some of the density and certainly the massing in the 3 townhouse units, put it back over into the North Villas. And reduced.
Right, into the tower.
Okay,
Yeah,
all right. And so
exactly.
that what is resulting there now are 2 story, correct?
Yes, that's
Okay,
correct.
thank you.
And I think the question you were asking, John, is on page
Help me.
15 of the staff report, on item number 3.
I made it up. Thank you, Fanny.
Is you looking for the question?
No, it's fine. I mean, yeah, I'm good. It got answered. Thank you.
I have a question, for the access into the North Villas, there's the ramp that comes down. Now, does that ramp also go under the hotel or is it only, there'll be a left-hand turn under the North Villas?
So each of these areas, the north, south, and then the hotel have 3 distinct parking garages.
Okay. There it is.
That's it.
Yeah.
That is just- I mean, maybe you could just take me,
Sure.
in this exhibit here, we have an exhibit on the left, but if you could just take me through the exhibit on the right.
So
This, take your mic
it's on
back.
top of it.
Yeah.
Gotta have a mic.
Yes, thank you.
So this building here, this whole section here
Yes.
sits on top of this.
Okay.
So you enter the garage here from a ramp off of Alvarado. And all of this parking serves what's above.
So the ramp we see on the exhibit to the right, it's just this,
Which ramp?
the exhibit
This
on the
one here?
left, yeah. and
Yes,
there's-
that's-
It doesn't show the extension to the road.
That's there.
That's just, that's just the portion of the sky, a portion of the ramp that continues down. When there's head clearance enough, we're trying to maximize the amount of coverage, so that if you're not looking down into the ramp, we can maximize the amount of landscaping and amenities at that level when we have sufficient head clearance.
Now, as you drive down that ramp, let's say to the driver's side on your left, is that just the building wall coming down, following the grade of the ramp as concrete, or is there finish on it? Is there a detail or view of that, what that might look like?
Oh, the ramp itself. At this point, I don't think we've determined that there's a particular finish. I think it was a plaster finish over the concrete wall, but I don't know that we're, looking at making it super elaborate. But, we are using, in other places on the site, in the landscape, we are using board form finish off concrete as a language. We hadn't introduced much of that in the villas, although maybe that's an opportunity to tie the two projects together. We hadn't really considered it, but maybe that's not a bad idea to consider.
But the ramp is right up against the.
There's about 10 feet between the hotel and the ramp wall, so there's a bit of land there between the two.
But really not much between.
Oh, you're saying on the villa side?
Yes, sir.
I think there's only a few feet on that side as well, so maybe there's some opportunity to change that as well. The ramp is, I think, we're showing 26 feet or something, 27 feet. So possibility to treat that wall as well, since it, I guess your point is it starts to look like part of the facade practically, because it's almost aligned.
Right, and that's, people will see that every time they go.
Sure. Yeah, that's a good
And
observation.
that'll be open.
Yeah, so there might be some practical treatment to that wall as well, that lends itself to the language of the overall complex.
Okay, thank you. Is there any further questions from the board?
Yeah. What's more accurate? Are the renders more accurate or the elevations? Or
Well,
most updated? And I can
think-
give you a specific example.
I think the renders probably came a little later in the process, so there are probably material embellishments in the renders that the elevations didn't entirely have.
I just want to look at a specific, because what it gets to is it gets to durability and materials. So if we go to page 14. So Edward, can you pop that up? Can you pop up page 14?
You don't have it. Let me see if I can pull, the applicant's got the whole set of it, hold on. Oops. There. Here we go. This one?
Yep. Okay, so this is just me trying to understand materiality. I think some of the things you guys are doing here are really well done. So I'm looking at contrast in the south villas. And I see what looks like a mass of horizontal wood. And then to the right of that, I see what looks like a mass of concrete. And it could be a panelized concrete, but those two things. So my first question was, why aren't those the same? So then I was looking at the renders, and the balcony stopped short of the wood vertical element. But if I go to the elevation on 46, the balconies actually wrap over that element, but they don't wrap over the concrete. And this isn't to catch you in oh gee, we really screwed up here. It's where is this thing going? And how deep are those balconies if they do wrap over that wood element?
Yeah, I think that's probably,
I see what you're saying.
yeah, I think that's probably a graphic change in the elevation that came during the renderings to keep the wood panel wall more solid, more monolith.
So the deck would stop short. It wouldn't
Yeah, I
actually
think the
wrap
deck
over.
would terminate at the line of the panels.
Okay. And so while I'm on the panels, I see in the material board that there's vertical wood slats, there's wood looking metal soffit, there's wood siding. where are you guys headed with the visible vertical wood elements? Are they going to be some kind of composite? Is it gonna be metal that gets a wood grain veneer over it?
No, I think we're shying away from the metal with veneers. They tend to not last very long. And if anything, the material for the wood probably would be a synthetic, some sort, for durability.
Yeah, I think you guys really need to look at that, because it's, maybe here on the north side, it's not gonna be as intense, but anything that's facing south, east, west, it's just gonna get beat, and there's gonna be continued cycles of maintenance that I think if you do, if you do it right going out, those cycles are on the order of 8 to 10 years instead of 2 to 4 years. Can you tell us a little bit about, there's a step detail in the overhangs that we see from below. So if we go, help you guys out, we go to page, let's say we go to 17. And maybe 18, because it zooms in a little more. Yeah. So there's a wood looking soffit that then wraps up. And then it's terminating underneath the metal fascia, which it's a good look. One of the things I think all the residents and occupants and passerbys will see is this kind of view up into these soffits. So the soffits are, they add that level of warmth, they add dimensionality to this, but again, you're taking something that's potentially organic and wrapping it vertical into the sun, and it's a really tough detail to pull off here. It's just so desiccating that we've used Parklex. Are you familiar with Parklex? So Parklex works. We've had it 10+ years on facades. But anytime we use wood, we're using it on the underside, completely horizontal, but never exposing it to the ends like that. It'll kill the end of the wood grain, and it'll just be a really, really hard thing to maintain.
Yeah, I think there are really two things going on here in the architecture. One is the profile itself, to have an articulation and not just be the blunt metal edge. So we like the stepping approach. Whether that vertical portion is still wood or not, I think it's probably up to debate. It probably couldn't hurt to be a metal trim of some sort as well. I think that's the one side of it. Again, as you said earlier in your statement, where the wood soffit primarily is what you're gonna read, especially at night, it's gonna tend to glow, there'll be lighting up there, and you'll start to read that warmth. And we wanna keep the wood soffit, but that immediate facade edge treatment, I think we like the stepping and the profile. We wanna maintain something of that nature. Maybe we'll just look at what that material is for its longevity.
And I too was kind of seduced by the south buildings overhangs, which feel broad and feel like they are really generous. But then when one looks around, and including this view 18, that balcony, the second from the top, doesn't have the same depth, but yet it's facing west, just like the penthouse and the unit below. Are we correct in understanding you're gonna pull those out so that they're much deeper and broader in these conditions?
Yeah, I think you need to look at, well, this is again a west exposure, so making them super long doesn't entirely help the western sun. But they were intentionally different from floor to floor. We didn't want the building just to look like a layered cake and every floor was a repeat of the last. And there's to some degree some functional issues with respect to how the structures and some of the cantilevers that come out of the garage and to make efficient parking come up through the building. So those balconies were intentionally not all the same. We can certainly look at making them longer, and we'll have to look at our structural engineer and talk about those things. And also the glass line in some respects, I think we're looking at not making the glass quite so uniform. The glass may step back in planes. And instead of the balcony becoming longer by extending the canopy, the glass line might recede to achieve some of that.
Yeah.
So it breaks up the facade a little more. We're actually studying that on right now.
We
For other
totally-
reasons.
I
From
get
an
it.
interior planning standpoint, there's some of these things that come to be interesting to us. The character doesn't change very much.
We can only review what you're showing us, and I can't get in your head. And if I could push that glass line back in versus pulling the balcony out, I'd do that all day long. If I could add vertical fins to this thing, I'd do that all day long. If I could do an Olson Kundig metal piece that extended out and changed materials, I'd do that all day long. And so you've got a kit of parts here that you can start working with. I'm just telling you that the overhang just feels a little timid for a west facade in Palm
On the
Springs.
fourth floor. Yeah, some of the other floors are more ample. The lower floor, the second floor is kind of obscured by the trees in the play, but, yeah.
Well, and we can get to the villas that in some instances don't have any overhangs, and granted, on a north, yeah. We're all on board, no overhangs necessary, but it speaks to the language of these more volumetric punched windows. And so I'd like to see those get extended and pulled out.
That's on the east side with the morning sun.
Well, the expression of the architecture on the smaller buildings, is that what you're referring to, is a little bit more of a punch window expression in comparatively to the other two buildings, so. They tend to be a little bit more solid. Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, but I mean, the architecture falls into that category of we're going to put an overhang on it, and that overhang is gonna be at the roof line, but the windows may be floating down 4 feet, 6 feet, 8 feet, a whole story below, and the overhang doesn't do a whole lot. So the view that's up, view 16, if I go to the townhouse on the left, I've got a little overhang facing east, and I've got a large glazing element there that probably could use some intermediate shading. They could, attach that to the mullion, attach fins to the mullion, do something that isn't a whole rejiggering of the architecture, but does give solar control to something that really is a heat cannon, if you will.
It was part of, I guess, the overarching comment about easterly and westerly exposures, so, something to consider with respect to any of those exposures across the board. As you said, I don't have the answer right now, we'll have to consider what may be appropriate, and, now that we're defining the interiors a little more, with a little more respect to the interior finishes and what the interior shapes and volumes of the interior room want to be, they might lend itself to even some deeper kind of recesses for the windows themselves and more shadings. I don't think it's necessarily a total material change, it might be a detail.
Yeah, just take another shot at it. As a graphic, it looks like the north building, we see dash lines for overhangs. So in plan, we see a dash line, and we can kind of start to understand overhang length. And you can go to a plan of the north building. Somehow got stuck on
You
the
want an
stuff.
upper floor?
Yeah, just where we see those, so we see a dash line there, so that's a graphic technique that I can understand where the overhangs are. But if we go to the south building, those same dashes seem to be absent. And is it just that the balconies are the prevailing overhang? And that they coincide with the level above? So if I go to page 42. I don't see any dashes on here,
Mhm.
so I don't know where the overhang.
I think that's a couple of things occurring, actually, there's probably a graphic, the patios themselves and the terraces on the upper levels.
Yeah.
Act as.
Okay, so those
shading for
are
lower levels. These are
co-planar.
co-planar, yeah, they extend to the same degree. I thought that was indicated in the elevations in the sections. but, yeah, I think if you look at, well, for example, on page 48, you can see the extent of some of the balconies, covering. Both, say they both these views are looking west, for instance, so that would be to your left, the south exposure. And there are similar treatments on the other exposures as well.
Are the glass rails, are they embedded in a shoe or is there a post and embedded condition?
They're cantilevered.
Tom, that's all I have.
Thank you, Lance. Any other members, questions? Seeing none.
Oh,
Member Walsh.
sorry, circling back again. The staff report is excellent. It's
Mhm.
comprehensive. From my perspective, it is like thorough and it's a good read of, and it articulates a lot of concerns that you wouldn't get at a cursory look, but it has taken more of a study. When I see the additional concerns and recommendations, I just kind of want to know your approach to this, because you've got 10 or 11 of them, each one, it's quite a litany, but each one is worthy of a half hour or 1 hour discussion. If there's some conflict, then in terms of the functionality of what's being suggested and prescribed versus what the conditions are that make you do something else. Have you gone through this staff report?
Yes, we have.
Okay, and do you feel that you've addressed all of the concerns and recommendations where we have the criteria and findings side by side?
We're well on their way to doing it.
Yeah, I want to say that the staff report was written after the submittal of this material. So part of the reason staff is recommending a continuation of today's hearing is to give them the appropriate time to address these issues.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will avoid diving into any of them, but they're good and they're targeted in terms of functionality, safety issues. I think they've given you a roadmap to make a better project. And I think it deserves full integration and discussion. I guess that I'm just making a point. Thank you.
Thank you, Member Walsh.
I was just gonna say, we actually are all getting together, so obviously we take the recommendation seriously.
Yeah.
And we'll be doing a thorough review, looking at it from multiple places. One, why they're recommending it. Two, is it possible? Is it within our budget? Does it make sense? Did we not explain something well enough?
Mhm.
There's many angles to take, so, but we as a team, will be definitely.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Well, comment. The roof line is very, very clean, but on the residential part, you're going to have to, by California code, install solar panels. I'd like to see something that shows how that's gonna affect the overall look of the building.
It's very early for us. We're in discussions with our mechanical consultants and we're getting proposals for power and also trying to look at, in addition to solar, like heat pump, what other, so that we can maximize our alternative energy sources. That will not come back that quickly. It's a long process. And so we've already gotten a brief analysis of what's possible on the roof lines. And we're gonna have to expand that and looking for other ways to enhance the solar. One of the benefits to solar, obviously on the residential, is it does shield some of our mechanical, which is good for that. Helps with that, but we do recognize we have that responsibility.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Thank you. If there's no further questions of the applicant, I think at this time we would like to open it up to any public comment related to the project.
Just a minute. Well, there were some members of the public who were wanting to speak, if I can just get myself to that point. Bear with me just a minute, Mr. Chair. Oh, there we go. And then I wonder if there's somebody who listed over. Anyone here on the Zoom call who would like to speak at this time on this matter, if you would you please raise your hand in the Zoom forum? At one point, there was a hand that was raised earlier. Anybody that's in the Zoom room here, does anybody wish to speak on this item? Apparently not. I may want to see if there's anybody here in
Yes,
the room.
is there, seeing none on the Zoom call, is there anyone in the audience that wishes to speak? Please come forward. Thank you.
Thank you, committee chair and committee. My name is Tom Boudreau.
Turn on your
Oh,
microphone.
sorry about that. Back to you. Okay, my name is Tom Boudreau. I've been, I'm a resident at Center Court and have been sort of a voice, sometimes loud, at various committee meetings with the Planning Commission, with City Council, working with Lori. And the things that Lori presented today, she's exactly right about. She's worked with us. She's heard our concerns. Heights have been brought down close to us. The bigger heights have been brought away from us. Distances are at a really good level for us. And for the most part, we're exceptionally pleased with what was presented to you in the April 4th submittal. There is a but, and that one but is this. When we saw the size of the North Tower, or what I guess you'd call the North Villa condo block, those condos that kind of floated, they got pretty big. The footprint got large. One unit was actually dropped, which would tell me that probably the spaces got a little larger, and that's lovely. But in that expansion, what happened was those 3 townhomes, which are sort of the thing that we look at, got a little bit more compressed, a little less air, a little less light. Frankly, one of them actually got pushed back further away from us than was originally planned, which of course we were dancing in the streets about. The concern comes to this. The 2 townhomes that face us are 24 feet in height, which is exactly what was promised. And that's wonderful. The sight lines that are created are pretty darn good. Our concern is this: if through the recommendation, those 3 townhomes get juxtaposed in any way, you have to be aware that on page 36 of your submittal, not all 3 townhouse buildings are 24 feet. They escalate to 30 feet at one point. And so if they get juggled in any way, all of a sudden our sight lines change, and things that were sort of in a nice perspective, in a nice scale, all of a sudden get bigger. So I would ask, as you review any changes that come along, that you would just bear us in mind. We're a short, puny, dowdy little old HOA community. And we just would like to preserve that 24 feet that is 50 feet from us as best we can, which will allow those sight lines to work out beautifully all the way up. And that's pretty much it. That's the big but. What happened on the South Villas is wonderful. Thank you on the mechanicals. The mechanical building, that looks really, really cool. It gives more space, it gives more light. So it truly is just our concern that if anything gets jiggered on that North Villa townhouse issue, it could impact us in a negative way, and we're eager to not have that happen. Exactly right. There you are. That's exactly it. And so it appears,
And is the current height 27 now?
there you go, you found it.
There's 3
Yeah.
different
You
heights.
found
If you look on page 36, you can see the heights that are listed. They vary between 24 and 30 foot 6 inches.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the ones that face us, this is my unit here, unit 11. And so this is 24 feet and wonderful. But if you look on page 6, it indicates that all 3 buildings, you don't see the third one, it's obscured, it's just in the back. It says that all of them are 24, but that is not the case any longer. They get bigger as they go back. Does that really impact our sightline? Probably not. Because they're that way. I mean, this is our sightline here. So does it matter to us in the grand scheme of things? Probably not. We're just eager that if things get juxtaposed because of the recommendations from staff, which I understand and I would agree with, that things don't get turned around and all of a sudden we're looking at a 30-foot roof line. That would just kind of not make us happy. But anyway, it looks great. We're thrilled for it. Lori, thank you again for keeping that in mind and actually improving the plan. And we support that with that one caveat. And I thank you for hearing me.
Thank you. Is there any other members of the audience that wish to speak at this time? Please come forward. Seeing none, we will close the public comment.
Mr. Chair, you may want to call down the applicant for rebuttal or the applicant to rebut what he just said.
Yes.
Just to say that because of the sightline and because we've been respectful of that sightline, even if you requested, we wouldn't be able to move the 30-foot towards that because we would then break through that sightline. And that sightline was set at council and at planning. So we have to respect that at that angle, which is why anything that's tall is further back. So just to say, so you're safe.
Thank you, Laurie. Okay, with that, we will close public comment and begin committee discussion. Member Walsh?
Mr. Chairman, did I understand correctly from staff that what you felt to be an effective path forward would be a continuation?
Correct, but I also want the committee to provide comments that you may see fit that will help to further improve to make it a more successful project. So that by the time we bring it back to you, I don't know, a couple weeks or so, those questions that we have and that you may have will be adequately addressed.
Got it. Okay. I would certainly think that toward that end, the staff report has been so well put together that would provide a platform from which all initial discussions would begin with the applicant and whatever else we come up with this evening. But I think that is the cornerstone to use that list.
Correct. We could use that list as part of our motion and then add, yes, other additional items that were brought out during our question and answer period. Is there anyone who'd like to start? Member O'Donnell?
Yeah. Well, certainly the goal here is to be thorough now so that the applicant and the design team doesn't get into that revolving door of, piecemealing little pieces as we go along. So, I think it behooves us just to be thorough now, just for their sake, that what we can identify tonight, and maybe Edward, we can work with you, and if something comes up at midnight tonight or tomorrow, and one of us thinks of something, we can send you additional comments, just so that they have a compendium of things that they can just tackle. Because otherwise, we've seen these things where everybody gets frustrated because we'll see something new the next time, or whatever that may be. So, I'm just gonna start with my list. What I would like to see would be a quick presentation on what the mechanical system is going to be. If it's going to be a bunch of individual mini split units on that roof, which if I were doing the project, I think that's the direction I would go. If I didn't have a cooling tower, and I didn't have a central system, and we're selling these things individually, I would meter them individually And I would heat and cool all of these and tie the owner to heating and cooling them, which means there's gonna be a multitude of little systems somewhere. And if they're on the roof, great, let's identify, we don't need the mechanical engineer to tell us exactly what they're gonna be, but somebody's gonna start accounting for the area that that's gonna take on that roof. So if those equipment screens expand out, we're adequately showing what those things are eventually gonna wind up being, because that's gonna be, it's gonna be an element that's gonna start to affect, could start to affect the architecture. The other thing I wanna see
So,
is,
so just for clarification, so are you asking to see what the mechanicals actually are, or are you just concerned about what the material is to screen them?
let me just take an example, page 45. So if we go to page 45, there's a roof plan. On that roof plan, there is two conceptual rectangles that say roof MEP. And what I would like them to do would be to account for the number of these little units that are gonna get stuck in there. So if there's, for example, 12 units below, and the engineer off the back of the napkin says, I need 2 condensers feeding the air handlers in the room, that there'll be 2 condensers for room 202 identified on the roof, or wherever it's going. So that once that accumulates into the package of how many of these things there are, we can see, yeah, those fit. Or, you know what, this came back to us with a larger corral for all of those units because they identified that we need a larger corral. And here's how it affects the architecture. And I'm confident they're gonna be able to pull it off, but it's a good exercise to do at this stage to just make sure we're not, or the neighbors or the community isn't coming back and going, gee, we didn't think it was gonna be that big up there. So that's one. The other one, I would like to see some dimensions on the overhangs in plan. So where those dashed lines are just simply, it could be just a simple little dimension where we can quickly look at the plans and then knowing the orientation, just use some, quick judgment to say, yep, that feels adequate. I would like to see a very strong and rigorous attitude about the wood materials that are going to be proposed and where they are and what it is. If they are, so anything that's organic, want to know what that is. Inorganic materials, board form concrete, those sorts of things. Not really concerned about the durability of that, that'll last forever. I may think of something else, but that's it for starting.
Detail on the bridge structure connection.
Oh, somebody will get to that. I got it. Okay.
Member McCoy?
Yes, this staff report is excellent. Thank you for being so thorough. I was asking about the walls earlier, and it does appear that they've got an inconsistency in their labeling. So clarification on that would help. I understand in the presentation, the reasoning behind the 8-foot wall. I was out on site and directly across the street on Amato, the convention center has a wall that is more than 7, but less than 8. So maybe there's a similarity that can be given in there. Very much like the shade aspect of the plan. I am not sold on the idea of the Chinese elms along Amato. They, as you noted, they are deciduous in the winter and their roots can be invasive. But conceptually, the look and where it's going is terrific. let's see. I know Member Dosey has some more landscape comments that I will let him continue on.
Thank you. Member Thomas?
Well, I would echo a lot of what's been said. I think the staff report is excellent. I love the mix of materials. I think the project looks absolutely fantastic. I love the wood form concrete, the wood, the stucco, the glass. I think the elements are absolutely beautiful. I think it's gonna be a really lovely addition to the community. My big concern is just shade, shade, shade. I think sometimes people think they have shade, but there are a lot of conventions here in the summertime. The hotel's gonna be full, hopefully, and as a benefit to the convention. I think some mixture of overhang on the west side, and, we get a lot of sun on the east, so I would just encourage you to think about some really interesting ways to provide some shade on the east side of the project, for the morning sun. Other than that, I really think it's quite good. It's excellent. Thank you.
Thank you, Member Thomas. No further questions. Any further comments or?
Sure, I'll echo so far what's been said. I think the staff report's really well done. I do have one question, or not question, but comment to make on it. It says to use frosted or obscure glass for the terrace balconies. And I don't know that I would agree with that. I think the Claire is fine. We've allowed it to be used at Living Out Loud on Tockwitz. I think that they can control what's on those balconies through HOA rules. So I think the building would look better with the clear glass. Otherwise, I don't have anything else to say, other than I was on the AAC back when this first came through in 2007, so I remember what it looked like originally. So it looks much better. It's a great looking project.
Thank you, Member McCoy. And
No, Walsh, I'm Walsh.
the other one.
I don't have any, but.
Okay, thank you. I would like to say your presentation package is beautiful. You've really done a fine job. I think the building and the massing and the juxtapositions of the balconies and really makes a beautiful composition. A couple, and the staff report, I think, is very thorough, and we will support the staff's recommendations. I have a couple comments in addition to some of the comments that have been made. And I think it's mostly, I didn't see a actual grading plan or engineering plan in the packet. And I don't know if that's available for our next meeting or, and the only thing I was looking for that is like street alignment, curb alignment to the projects to the east of us, along the motto and so forth, but just to kind of get a feel for what's happening with the grade and the topography. As part of another item that I would hope that the design team could look at is actually widening that sidewalk along the motto. And, on the site plan, there's quite a large area, I think it's called the open lawn or the lawn area.
Yeah, like the tennis balls practice.
Yeah, and it has, along the motto, we're looking at a pretty straight wall, and there's a lot of movement within the project. And I was hoping we could pick up some footage there to give that shade, keep a parkway so the trees could be planted between the curb and the sidewalk. But look for a way that we could find some additional movement. I don't know if that wall can be moved back or if it's related to an underground parking issue, but.
Would you like to comment?
Yeah, we'll finish the motion. Yeah. The event lawn in South Garden area. And then also to take a look, maybe engineering could look at, that little offset in the curb. It doesn't look like it's really a travel way. But again, would that be an opportunity to move the curb, closer to the center line of a model and pick up that additional space? And that way they could widen the sidewalk to 6 feet and still keep a parkway for the shade trees to be on the street side. I think Lance brought up some good comments about, you know, the integration of the solar panels, because they may become and mechanical equipment part of the architecture, as they develop the drawings further. And I had one question, and I know this site plan has been in place. There's a couple areas that are west, of Center Court, where it looks like there's parallel parking spaces, along the drive aisle. They would be, you know, east of the north villas and north of the south villas where there's parallel parking. And I don't see landscape material in there, so I don't know if there's a landscape buffer or enough room for one. There are some trees. And I guess the question is that parking area part of the parking required calculations, or is there an opportunity to add a screening buffer?
Well,
Yeah, on page 56, it would be in areas.
Adjacent to the condominiums.
Yeah, Jason,
The south border of the condominium.
number.
There's shade trees that are in between those, parallel parking spaces, but, I don't think there's. Oh, no, let's see, I don't think there's any plant material on that one.
Yeah, and again, because of the scale of the plans, it's hard to see if there's 4 feet and there's 6 feet. How close that curve actually comes to the wall. On the northern section, they do show the green line or somewhat of a hedge on there, but maybe we could just see a cross section through there and see if there's some opportunity.
Actually, it looks like it's, on page 15. Let me see if I can get this thing. I think this is the area you're talking about. The area in the forecourt of the lower image here is where the Center Court condos are. So what you're seeing there, on the north is to the right in this drawing. You're looking south and west. And so what you're seeing here is that row of fence post cactus along the perimeter of Center Court condos. And then in addition to these, where's that thing? In addition to, that row of, fence posts and that row of fence posts are, shade trees along that perimeter edge also.
And what we're not seeing here is the actual wall.
Correct.
These would be on the project side of the wall. Yeah, I think it would be good just to see a cross section through there and see if we can get some additional planting or some taller materials in there. And is it, the correct assumption that that parking is needed as part of the overall parking calculations?
Yeah. It is part of it. It is part of it, yeah.
Thank you. Okay. With
Tom,
that-
I did have
Okay.
one more.
Wrote down, please.
Thank you. Can we go to page 23? So if I look conceptually at the thicknesses of the structure, it looks like they've got enough structure in there, but one of the things gonna go on those balconies is at the level of the quality of this project is probably a floating pedestal paver. So the rain is gonna hit that upper deck. It's gonna go between the pedestal pavers to probably a single ply membrane roof. And then from that single ply membrane roof, go to a roof drain that somehow has to get down from that roof. Down through the floor below it, down through the floor below that, down to the floor. And then terminate somewhere either in some kind of nuisance water management system that they have going on, but I would like to have a little presentation in next time how the roof drains get from the roof down to the ground. And if we're gonna see more solid wall as a result of that, or we're gonna see more chases, or we're gonna see things that affect the elevations, then it would be good to see those sooner than later. Then the next one is, there's just, when we do these projects, there's just a whole lot of venting that comes up through all the plumbing fixtures, that come up through floor to floor. And I'd like to at least see on this corner building how they're handling the roof vents. So right now, that little wood element over there has some nice barrel cactus on it and has some other things going on. I'm concerned that what it will turn into, and it's not a big deal, but it's gonna turn into a collection of pipes that are terminating at the roof. And if that then needs to get a metal cowling around it to hide how those pipes are all ganged together and coming up and affecting the architecture, I think we should see that, just as a very conceptual level. This is how we would do it if we encountered this, we had our engineers design this thing, but invariably the stuff's coming up through and it's gonna terminate somewhere. And so these little planters are gonna go away, or something's gonna go away, or there's gonna be some cool little bench element that's created up there or something else, but those things may affect the architecture. So just working through those early on, I think it'll pay dividends later. That's it.
Thank you. Any further comments? Okay, seeing none with that, and we have a motion. Member Walsh.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would move for continuation with the following recommendations. Number one, that we use the staff recommendation and the staff report as a basic platform of items that we do support and want to see integrated or worked out with the applicant. And those are the items all listed in criteria and findings. Number two, conceptual mechanical system layout that identifies impacts on roof design. Secondly, same thing, mechanical system layout, plumbing with respect to venting. Third thing would be some level of comprehensive solar analysis project-wide, passive systems with respect to shading on glass, active systems with respect to the amount of solar panels that are going to be necessary and what their layout may be, should be, could be on rooftop. Also under passive systems would be architecturally, any overhangs should carry dimensions from this point out. Review, number 4, review of exterior materials, the weatherability of what is being selected. Number 5, a detail so that we can see what's going on with that bridge structure. Number 6, a grading plan that does a few things. First of all, to reanalyze the potential for some widening of the sidewalk on Amato with better articulation to the constancy of that wall. There might be some undulation, some room to be built in for some undulation of the wall. Also in the grading plan should be some sort of a drainage plan that identifies the collection of water, rooftop decks, and down to the point of discharge and whatever has to happen with that. And then on, okay, number 7 would be, if I'm counting correctly, 6 was the grading plan. 7 would be further development of the site plan and identification, graphic articulation on the drive aisle parking plan with respect to landscape. Cross section, where is it? What is it? What's its size? What's that capable of holding? Did I miss anything?
No, but you're gonna make the motion from here on out.
I just take good notes.
You do.
Do we have a second on the motion? And at that point, we could add additional items.
I'll second that motion.
Okay, we have a second by member O'Donnell. Is there any additional items or? I would like to add one that we see a cross section or an elevation of the north villas where the ramp goes down, what that elevation of the building and how that wall is finished as you drive down to the lower garage. Okay, with that, we have a motion and a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
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 Any opposed? Seeing none, the motion carries. Thank you for your presentation. Beautiful project. Next, we will, is there any committee reports, requests or comments from the committee? Staff?
We have just a few notes. As you may know, the city has begun its work with the consultant on the comprehensive overhaul of the zoning code. So they were on site last week and we've run them all over the city pretty much. To give them a overall view of it. So that is moving along. And you'll be hearing more about that as they dive into it in greater detail.
Ken,
And
what is the timetable on that?
I don't know. I don't know if Director Hadwin is still with us or not here.
I am, hi.
Thank you.
That I-
Chris. Voice from Ohio.
The overall timeline for that is about 22 to 24 months. So we've got a month or two under our belt already. But we're likely looking at some point late next year into early the year following before this would come forward for approval.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
Just in time to catch up on the book I have now. Right.
And thank you to everybody here as well, and especially thank you to my colleague Edward.
Yes.
He just got back from a very long trip and is suffering a little jet lag today, so thank you for.
We couldn't, you never know it. Mr. Energy.
I don't believe you can, Lance.
Yeah. Hey, Edward, I can think of one more thing. So they've identified trash chutes for their building, which work, right?
Yeah.
But in the single family, they're not identifying where the trash goes and how that's.
I did call out in the staff.
Do they?
Yeah.
Okay, well, good for you guys.
Yeah.
If I read the
It was
freaking
nuts and bolts.
I saw that. There's one
That's
more I
good.
have.
That's all we have.
And also
Mr.
follow the
Chair.
deliveries as well.
Thank you. So we'll adjourn the meeting, the Architectural Advisory Committee meeting at 7:15 PM.
Right.
Well done.
Thank you.
Under 2 hours.
Yeah, thank you all.
But I got some teeth in it.
Yeah.
Right, I remember in the old days, Lance, remember you'd have.
Oh, man, the whole wall.
Would be full, and you could walk up and look at each of those
So
buildings.
Dan,
Hands of detail.
Dan, big difference between.
These were
the
black and white.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Big time.
Yeah.
The other one was lots of stucco.
Yeah, lots of stucco.
Lots of stucco. This is so much cleaner.
So she gets it done.
Yeah, all right, everyone.
Oh.
Excellent.
Yeah.